So I guess welcome back to this continuing series of videos about past coral ecosystems and how we can kind of reconstruct, I guess, the past conditions of reef environments from the corals that lived on them. So this is basically a paper that we're going to just have a quick look through. So this is by Sandy Tudhope and many others. So Sandy, you may find will be teaching on some of these courses. This course, not these courses. This course he'll teaching on. Very great guy. So say hello to him. He's super awesome. Anyway, so along with others, he wrote this paper a while ago now, looking at reconstructing the El Nino Southern Oscillation, or ENSO, as it's sometimes shortened to, through a glacial interglacial cycle. So this is looking at very, very long timescales, looking back. So I guess quite a lot of the stuff we've been looking at so far is we've been looking back maybe only 100 or hundreds of years. So the glacial interglacial cycle actually goes back 130,000 years, which is a long time to be looking back. But, I'll have a look at that. So here's the study site. So this is Papua New Guinea, and on I guess the north coast of Papua New Guinea, we have these terraces. You can see over on the left-hand side, all kind of like step-like features in the landscape. And what's going on here is that these are, I guess, former fringing coral reefs that were at the coastline. But the landmass here is being rapidly uplifted by tectonic processes. So as you would walk from the beach up the hill, you're effectively walking back through time as you kind of walk up basically fossil coral reef systems. So what Sandy and I guess John Chappell did in this study was they went to these reefs in Papua New Guinea and sampled basically fossil corals from those reefs, brought them back to the lab, and started to measure some proxies in those for the environmental conditions. So I think those of you that have watched the video on oxygen isotopes as a climate proxy will have seen some of this plot already. But effectively, the proxy that we're going to be looking at is oxygen isotopes. So these were drilled powders out of the coral. So the corals were slabbed along their growth axis, and then little samples were drilled out, and then that calcium carbonate powder was then put into a mass spectrometer to measure its oxygen isotope composition. And the data that you can see here shows quite nicely the reconstructed. Get me a pointer. There we go. Got a pen. These nice annual cycles that are preserved in the oxygen isotopes, which are a combination of those isotope changes are driven by a combination of the sea surface temperature, changing the isotope fractionation between the water and the calcium carbonate, and the isotopic composition of the water, which is related to salinity, which is related to the local rainfall, which also goes kind of up and down. So I guess the first kind of question one might ask is, does it matter that we're not recording just temperature or just salinity? Our proxy is some kind of combination of the two. And I'll let you guys think about that and see if that matters or not. Spoiler, it doesn't. Yeah, so we'll move on a little bit from there. So why would I guess why would these corals actually, or the environmental conditions, be in one particular site in maybe Papua New Guinea? Let's look at our map here. Okay, so here is Papua New Guinea there. So why would that be reflective of the state of basically the whole El Nino system, which is a phenomenon that occurs over basically the whole of the Pacific Ocean and also beyond? So why measuring just one place is going to tell us about the whole. Well, what we can do is we can look at what kind of variability does the El Nino system actually exhibit. So what this is a study that's come out a little bit more recently. That's actually basically looked at the temperature data over the whole Pacific over the last, I guess, century or so, and it's tried to characterize basically the spatial pattern of variability. So they've basically taken maps of temperature variability each year and effectively done a principal components analysis, and that's what you can see down here. So this is the principal component analysis of basically 100 years of climate data across the whole of the Pacific. And you can see that that shows quite strong variability, going up and down, up and down, up and down. And if you take those data and do a time series analysis, so you basically do a frequency analysis, so to find out what kind of are the strongest periodicities within these data here. So you can see that maybe there's a periodicity that's maybe about this long. Another one there, another one there, another one there, one there, another one there. But you might also say, well, are there other periods in these data as well? Do we see maybe a long-term up, down, down, maybe there's a longer periodicity in there as well. We could think about that. So you can extract those periods by actually doing this frequency analysis. So we've got on the y-axis here, we've got basically how strong a particular frequency appears in this data set, and along the x-axis we've got the frequency. So we've got long wavelengths on this end and high frequency over on this end. So I guess that's transferred into the period at the top. So periodicity of 1 year is about here, periodicity of 10 years is here. And if the periodogram, which is this kind of data, are represented by this line here, if that basically falls, if you just had random noise, we would expect that to actually fall along this black curve here, and that you can see a kind of like short periods, so high frequency. Actually, the data here does look like it's very close to this line that we'd expect for noise, and that's not expected because any kind of climate variability that's kind of less than a year, that's effectively weather. Okay, and weather is kind of random and noisy, and we kind of expect that. And we can see that there's maybe a strong peak here that's maybe a little bit above random noise, and that's not entirely surprising. That occurs at 1 year, so that's basically the seasonal cycle. But we're also starting to see other peaks in this data set here at 2 and a bit years. There's a kind of a hump in the data here. There's a peak here at around 5 years. There's a peak here at, I guess this is just 3 years. So we see that there are within this kind of variability in this data set here, we are seeing that there are there's variability that occurs not just at the annual scale here, but also there seems to be cycles every 5 years and cycles every 3 years. And these are the kind of lengths we expect the El Nino system to occur in. So it takes approximately between 5 and 3 years for the Pacific Ocean to switch between an El Nino state and a La Nina state. So that's the variability that we're seeing. So what we can do now is see kind of, or we can do the same kind of time series analysis, or a similar approach. We can basically, rather than take the data and predict or process it to find out what frequencies it has, we can test data sets by filtering them in the same way that you maybe filter an audio file, and just pick out individual frequencies and see how intense they are in those records. And that's what we've got here. So basically what we're doing, I guess what Sandy did, was he's done a filter pass through some coral data and also some environmental data. So he's filtered these at between, I think, 3 and 5, or 2.5 and 5 years. So it's only showing the variability that's on that time scale. So if there's any longer term trends in the data or any shorter term annual cycles, those have been removed by this filtering. And we're just seeing the periodicity that we would expect from the ENSO system. So the thing to notice here that I guess the top 3 data sets here, these are all coral samples that I guess were sampled living. and extend back in time, back to, I guess some of the oldest are in the 1880s. And then we have records of the local rainfall, and they extend back into, I guess, the 20th century, not much before, because there weren't that many weather stations in Papua New Guinea in the 19th century. We have reconstructions of the local temperature from, I guess, a global compilation of temperature reconstructions. That's this one. So this is temperature. We have, and again, we have these two measures at the bottom. We have the Nino 3.4 index for ENSO. So if you remember back to the video on that had an introduction to how the ocean works and a bit about the ENSO system, that's basically the average temperature in a particular box of the ocean, which is used as a metric of describing how the state of the El Nino system is. It an El Nino or a La Nina state? So we can see how that has changed through time. And likewise, I also mentioned then you could also use differences in atmospheric pressure as a proxy for the El Nino system. So what we can see in these data are that these two metrics of the state of the El Nino southern oscillation, they agree very well with each other. These two curves are very, very similar. And it looks like we have strong periods of El Nino variability more recently, and then we have a prolonged period of weakness. Not El Nino didn't kind of, or the El Nino southern oscillation didn't appear to be very strong during the mid portion of the 20th century, and then before that, again, we return to strong variability before that. So I'll just so we've got strong, and then weak, and then strong. And we can look how those are reflected in, so the local sea surface temperature. It kind of shows a similar thing. So we've got this weaker interval here, less variability here, and more variability here, and a little stronger. Doesn't look exactly kind of the same. And if we look at the coral data, that similarly shows this pattern of being strong periods of El Nino variability in more recent times and in the early 20th and late 19th century, and the mid 20th century, this prolonged period of El Nino weakness. So what this suggests is that we can actually use the coral oxygen isotopes, we can measure them, we can what's called bandpass filter them, and then get a measure of how intense the variability of the El Nino system was at that time. What Sandy then did was, rather than just looking at modern corals, so here's one of those modern corals from modern corals from that plot before. Here are the raw data, and you can see there's lots of I guess it's not noise, it's real variability, but it's got a lot of high frequency variability in here, and it's got some long-term changes in it as well. Now both of those have been removed by this filtering process, so we're just seeing the variability that's within this 2.5 to 7 years. Sorry, I said 2.5 to 5, but 2.5 to 7 year variability, and we can see that pattern of more variation here and less variation in the middle part of the 20th century, and then more variation here. So we can then start to look at fossil corals. So sandy samples of corals from I guess one of the terraces that's quite near to sea level. So these are relatively young compared to something old. So these are corals that are only 2,000 to 3,000 years old. Has done the same process here, and you can see that actually some of this time then there seems to be lots of variability, but actually at other time shots there is less ENSO variability. Less variability. So we're just comparing basically the variances of these data. So we might conclude from this that actually a couple of thousand years ago, the El Nino system, so this mode of variability that we see in the Pacific, that wasn't quite as dominant a feature of the climate system as it is in our present climate. So it's not just one time shot we can look at. So Sandy measured a whole bunch of different corals across that whole sequence of terraces, a whole different range of ages. If we just have a look at this, the graph over on the right-hand side, so these are where the corals were sampled from, these grey bars. So we've got the modern kind of corals here. The Holocene is this period of climate here. So this is when, after the last ice age, climate was relatively stable for a couple of thousand years. And Sandy has a couple of corals from that period there. We've already looked at a couple of them. And then we go into the last glacial maximum down here. So this is when Earth's climate was drastically different, huge ice sheets over North America, Europe, couple of degrees Celsius colder, globally averaged temperatures, drastically different climate. We don't have any corals from that time, but we do have some from marine isotope stage 3. That's here. This was a kind of intermediate kind of glacial state. And we have another one from here where it's kind of glacial-ish. We have some corals from this period in time here. This is 120,000 years ago. So this is known as the last interglacial. So this is the last time when maybe ice sheets were in a similar configuration than they are today. It was maybe a little bit warmer on average than pre-industrial times, getting to be more similar to our current climate state. And we can have a look at the data from the corals that were sampled at these times. So we can see that here are the raw data over on the far left, I guess the filtered data in the coloured boxes. And actually, I guess the summary is over on the top on the right. So you can see actually in our modern, so I think the ones to look at are the black bars. This is basically showing that the amount of variance in these filtered coral data. So you can see that we have a high amount of variance in El Nino in the modern times, and then in the Holocene and in glacial times, it's kind of reduced, and then maybe a little bit higher during this last interglacial. So the finding of this paper was that actually the strength of the El Nino system under our current climate, I guess including the last kind of century or so, actually is kind of anomalous compared to the longer term geological history over maybe hundreds of thousands of years, at least 100,000 years, when El Nino was maybe a weaker phenomenon in the Earth system. So we'll leave that here, maybe discuss some of the details of the paper and the implications for our ability to reconstruct climate from the past, to learn about how the future may be different in the old tutorial session that we're probably going to have. So let's leave that there. Oh, there's a question. Let's think about that in the tutorial. So yeah, if we're grouping samples together rather than looking at individual samples, how does that affect how we calculate variance? I want to think about that for if you're a statistician. Right, I'm going to stop here. And